Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dharati Swapadantikam Vandeyam Shri Guru Shri Uta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sahajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Advaitam Savadutam Paridana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamsha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishabhano Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhivacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavari Paschata Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So, welcome to our continued study of Bhagavad Gita. So today we're beginning chapter 8. So, chapter 8 is a very wonderful chapter in which we hear about attaining the Supreme. And we went through in chapter 7 many wonderful topics, and in chapter 7 we learned about knowledge of the Absolute, and Krishna was explaining to all of us how to become in full consciousness of him, as he explained at the end of chapter 6, this highest of all yogis. And so he said, hear from me, understand how by hearing about Krishna we can increase our attraction, and then learn to see him as the his presence everywhere, the essence of everything, and the controller. We talked about these three things, right? So he is present everywhere because everything is either his apara or para shakti. Nothing is but an energy of Krishna. He is the essence of everything. The taste of water, the heat of fire, the light, the intelligence and ability of man. So everything he is the essence of. And of course we heard finally that he is a controller of everything. The three modes are performing all these different activities under the direction and control of Krishna. So we are able to see him and understand him everywhere. But of course not everybody sees due to the presence of Maya. And Krishna explained that this divine energy of his, it can be overcome very quickly by surrendering to him. Of course, this is the conclusion of knowing that he is the essence of everything, he is present to everything and a controller. It should naturally bring one to surrender. And then Krishna explained the four people who don't surrender to him. Those who are, materially engrossed. Those who have given up the practice of devotional service. Those whose intelligence has been stolen by Maya. Or those who are just outright atheists. The demons who are inimical to Krishna. So, then Krishna spoke about the four people who surrendered to him, though with some motive, either in money, need of money, or in distress, curious or wise. And how they are very pious, because by going to Krishna, they'll ultimately become purified from their desires. And Krishna will give them what is good for them, not give them anything that is not good for them. And so they slowly will become pure souls. Then Krishna talked about those who surrender to other persons, and talked about the demigods and how that is not a very intelligent means to surrender, because in essence they are surrendering indirectly to Krishna, and how it is only by Krishna's steadying of their faith, giving of the process, actually giving the fruits and the ability, all these ways, it is Krishna who's even facilitating this worship of the demigods, even though it is not the recommended process to fulfill the desire of the living entity. And so Krishna spoke about how this Maya, this Maya Shakti, this is what covers the understanding of who is Krishna. And he explained that we became subject to Maya by our Icha and Dvesha. We had desires and hatred of Krishna ultimately. And that led to us becoming illusioned by the reality. So chapter 8 then ended with Krishna explaining these 6 terms. And he talked about Brahman, Karma, Adhyatma, Adibhuta, Adidaiva, and Adiyagya. So these 6 terms he explained, Krishna did, in verses 729 and 730. And now Arjuna is opening this chapter with a question about these 6 terms, plus 2 additional questions. So we're getting a power-packed load of questions from Arjuna. And chapter 8 now is going to tell us exactly how to remember Krishna and what should be done at the time of death, so that we can attain the supreme eternal abode. So Krishna told in 6, be in consciousness of him. 7, knowledge about him, so we can have some understanding of how to know him. And now in 8, we're going to hear how to think about him at the time of death to attain the supreme. So he is giving knowledge about the how to reach this abode after giving knowledge about himself in chapter 7. And we'll hear about devotional service that is mixed with this concept of yoga. And we'll also hear about pure devotional service, Ananya Bhakti, and what determines where the soul goes in their process. So this is the kind of lead-in to this chapter. And in chapter 8, Krishna is also going to define what is supreme. You know, we have so many definitions. If you ask 100 people, what is the supreme goal? You'll get so many varieties. But there's actually only one complete supreme goal, and that is reaching the abode of Krishna, where we can render unending devotional service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So this is what we'll hear today in the coming weeks in this chapter 8. So now, as I mentioned, Arjuna is asking 8 questions of Krishna in the first 2 verses, and then Krishna is answering primarily the first 7 in verses 3 and 4. He touches on the 8th question, and then from verse 5 to the end of the chapter, he's going to focus on this last question of Arjuna. So we'll read the first couple of verses and then discuss them in detail. So in verse 1, Arjuna inquired, O my Lord, O Supreme Person, what is Brahman? What is the Self? What are fruitive activities? What is the material manifestation? And what are the demigods? Please explain this to me. And then in verse 2, who is the Lord of sacrifice? And how does he live in the body? O Madhusudana. And how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? So this last question, how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? That is the last of the 8 questions. And that is what Krishna will explain primarily starting in verses 5 through the end. So we'll just read again now Krishna's answers in 3 and 4, then we'll discuss each of them. So in 3 and 4, Krishna says, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the indestructible transcendental living entity is called Brahman, and his eternal nature is called Adhyatma, the Self. Action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entity is called karma, or fruitive activities. O best of the embodied beings, the physical nature which is constantly changing is called Adibhuta, the material manifestation. The universal form of the Lord, which includes the demigods, like those of the sun and moon, is called Adideva. And I, the Supreme Lord, represented as the Supersoul in the heart of every embodied being, am called Adiyagya, the Lord of Sacrifice. Okay? So now let's go back and start discussing each of these terms. So the first question was, what is Brahman? So Prabhupada explains in the purport that there are two references to Brahman. First is the Jiva, and then to Krishna or Paramatma. So there is Brahman and Parabrahman. And there's much confusion about whether they're the same. And Prabhupada talks about the different philosophies that are present, but we understand that the Jiva is Brahman. So Arjuna is clarifying that the Brahman referred to in the 29th verse of the last chapter, does that refer to the indestructible living entity and not the Supersoul? So that is what he is trying to clarify. So Krishna is explaining in the third verse that yes, this Brahman means spirit soul. Thus, I am spirit soul. Aham Brahmasmi. So the pure devotee is on the Brahman platform, knowing their spirit soul. And it is eternal in the meaning that the constitution or the position of that soul is never changed. It is always servant of Krishna, and we'll see that in Adhyatma. So again, Parabrahman is Krishna, Brahman is the living entity, the Jiva. And we know that the Jiva is part and parcel of the Supreme Brahman. Then the next question is, what is Adhyatma? So Srila Baladevi Debashan is explaining that the question is, Arjuna is asking, does this self pertain to the gross or subtle body? And the answer is no. There's no relation to any part of the body, either gross or subtle. Adhyatma refers to the transcendental, eternal nature of the living entity. And what is that nature of the living entity? It is to serve Krishna. So our nature in this material world, Prabhupada explains, is to try to be Lord of nature, right? To try to be the master of our domain. But actually the eternal spiritual nature is to serve Lord Krishna. So the nature is different in the spiritual world than in the material world. Right? And we see that why can we not enjoy anything in the material world? Why is there always setbacks, struggling, and challenges? Because our constitutional nature, our adhyatma, is not to enjoy matter. It is to enjoy spirit. Because we are connected with spirit. We are spirit. You know, we cannot be the supreme controller like Krishna is. And thus our attempts in this material world are always frustrated and defeated. And thus there is no enjoyment. It is not our nature. So our nature, our adhyatma, is to be in eternal service to Krishna. This is the eternal nature. And Prabhupada explains that we are considered a marginal energy. Marginal because sometimes we associate with matter and sometimes we associate with spirit. So we are, in between the two. And the example is given of the riverbank. The riverbank, that slanted part of the river bank, it is neither land nor is it river. It sits in between. You cannot define it as land, and you cannot define it as matter, as river. So the living entity is considered like that, marginal, sitting in between. But our eternal position, we should not be confused, it is to serve Krishna. Then, Arjuna asks, what is karma? Right? Is this the reactionary work that binds, or is this some kind of spiritual activity? So this is the question. So Krishna explains, karma is an activity that creates a material body. Why? Because it's an activity that has reactions. And thus the jiva becomes bound to those reactions. Right? Reactions mean that we have to come back and take another body. So a work that we do that creates a future body, that is karma. So sacrifices to the demigods, they lead to the heavenly planets. So they lead to another material body. Though they might be more beautiful, more elaborate, it's still a material body. And Prabhupada explains nicely in the purport that how the living entity may progress up to the higher planetary systems and enjoy for some time. But when their credits are used up, they have to return back. And he explains how they actually return back. So they return back to the earthly planet through the rain. The living entity falls into the rain, enters into the ground, and then becomes one of the grains of food that is then eaten by the man, and then that enters the semen and ultimately is embodied again through impregnation into another material body. So this exact scientific process also of how the living entity comes back from the heavenly planets. So these first three questions, they discuss the difference between body and soul. Right? So we are Brahman, spirit, soul. And what is the activity of that? It is adhyatma, right? The living nature of service to Krishna. But if the living entity tries to do karma instead of adhyatma, then it creates future bodies, the binding work of reactionary activities. So the soul is spiritual and its nature is to serve Krishna, and when it's not in its nature, it does karma. So this is the first three of the 6 terms that Krishna presented in the last chapter that now Arjuna has asked questions about. Right? So then Arjuna asks about the material manifestation. What is this material manifestation Krishna is referring to? So this Adibhuta, it is the ever-changing material nature. And Krishna is the controller of this ever-changing nature. So the nature is very dynamic. It always is in flux. Nothing is eternal in the material world. Thus, some will say it's illusion. Well, it's not quite illusion, it's just temporary. And the reason it's temporary is as soon as I try to define my body, it's changed. It's got a different molecular count. It has a different situation. Anything you try to define in the material world, but as soon as you define it, it's changed. And that is the constant evolving situation of anything within the material world. So this is Adibhuta. And Prabhupada explains how the living entity, it goes through these 6 stages of transformations, from birth to growth, reproduction, maintenance, dwindling, and ultimately death. And so all the living entities are pushed through these 6 transformations by the factor of time that we'll hear about later in chapter 11. But this is the way this material manifestation works under the supreme ordain of the Lord. And we see, anything that we have in a material nature, as soon as we build some car or some house, it starts to die. It starts to deteriorate, right? It starts to slowly break down. And this is the power of the Supreme Lord. That how powerful this Creator is. All of mankind collectively, with all of its intelligence, is trying to preserve things within this material world. Yet nobody can stop this ever-changing nature. Nobody can stop it. So much effort has been put forth to try to stop death, to make permanent buildings, to make permanent, clothing, anything that we want. We want it to last forever. They say a diamond is forever. Not even that. So this nature is controlled, this ever-changing aspect is controlled by a very powerful force, and that is Krishna. And we can appreciate his power by understanding how everything is going through this change. Okay? Now, who is the Adideva? The governor or lord of the demigods. So Krishna explains that the Adideva is the universal form. He is the source of the demigods. The demigods have no separate existence. They are parts of the body of this universal form. We talked about this last week. And so this universal form is all-inclusive. Right? And then Adiyagya, who is the Lord of Sacrifice. We saw in the end of chapter 5, Bhakta Rabhigna Tapasam, Arjuna is again clarifying. Right? So, who is ultimately to be worshipped? Indra, the chief administrator of the demigods, or Lord Vishnu? And so, Krishna has explained that the Adiyagya is the super soul, Paramatma. And where does he reside? That was the seventh question. In the heart of the living entity. So the Lord of Sacrifice is Krishna, the Supreme Lord. And Prabhupada explains that the Krishna and Paramatma are one and the same, represented in two different features. Right? So we don't separate the two. So this is the first 7 questions that Arjuna has asked. Right? So now his 8th question, how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? So Krishna spoke and at the end of chapter 7 about those in full consciousness of me know me, and I'm paraphrasing, the Supreme Personality of Godhead even at the time of death. So that was Krishna's last statement in chapter 7. So this has intrigued Arjuna, being on a battlefield, right? Death is imminent on one side or the other. So he's asking, in the last of his 8 questions here, how can one in bhakti, devotional service, know you at the time of death? So this is initially in reference to Adibhuta, Adiyagya, and Adideva. So this is the most important question. Because the result of knowing Krishna at the time of death is one achieves the supreme abode, which is the ultimate result one can obtain. So death is very difficult experience. So Arjuna is asking, in the midst of this difficulty, how one can remember Krishna. So Krishna has explained that if we know Krishna as the governing principle of this ever-changing nature, the governing principle of the devatas, and the beneficiary of all sacrifice, then this allows us to do all of our work, no matter where we are doing our duty, even on the battlefield, in the case of Arjuna, and remember Krishna, even at the time of death. We'll be able to see him everywhere. Right? So working in knowledge of Brahman, I am spirit soul, on the spiritual platform, my adhyatma, in avoiding karma, no future bodies, no more reactions, I'll be able to remember Krishna. So these 6 terms combine to answer that question. So now Krishna is going to very directly answer this 8th question, starting in verse 5. He's given the broad construct with these 6 terms, but now starting in verse 5, remembering Krishna. And this will carry on now for the rest of this chapter, this 8th question that Arjuna has asked. How to remember him at the time of death. So in verse 5, Krishna says, and whoever at the end of his life quits his body remembering me alone, at once attains my nature. Of this, there is no doubt. So what is the key to going home back to Godhead where we came from? Remembering Krishna at the end of life. That's it. That is the key. And so how to do this, Krishna is going to explain starting in the 7th verse. But this is the principle of going back home, to remember Krishna. And so Prabhupada now is speaking very mercifully in these purports to us. Because what is the best way to ensure success of remembering Krishna? And Prabhupada explains that remembering Krishna is not possible for the impure person who has not practiced Krishna consciousness. So what to do? By continuously chanting the holy names of the Lord from the beginning of one's life, one can find success. So we're going to see this throughout this chapter, particularly in the next 2 verses, this emphasis on chanting the holy names of the Lord. So Prabhupada writes in the fifth purport, he says that, just trying to find it. He says here that therefore one should constantly, incessantly chant the Maha Mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Prabhupada said, this is the key to success. You have to chant the holy names of the Lord. This is the best way. So this chanting, it makes very deep impressions in the mind that can help change the state of consciousness at the end of our life. Each time we chant, we are making deep impressions in the mind, and it is purifying the mind. And by chanting, we revive the memories of all of the different activities and things that we have heard about Krishna, his different pastimes, the different services we have done, pulling the chariot of Lord Jagannath, as we are supposed to be doing tomorrow. All these different pastimes. As we chant, they revive them in our consciousness. And by engaging the tongue and the ears and the mind, we can stay focused on hearing. So when we chant, we should try to hear every word of Hare, Krishna, and Rama. All 16 in every mantra we should hear. And this creates the mind's absorption in Krishna. And as we'll see in the next couple of verses, this is the practice for us to be able to remember Krishna at the time of death. We have to start now. Right? So Prabhupada comments at the end of this purport a very important point. And surely none of you have experienced this, but I know I have. There are impediments in the process of chanting. There are challenges. So what to do? What quality must we develop? Tolerance. Obstacles are going to come. It's snowing out, it's too hot, I have fever, I'm tired, I had a long day at the office, I had this, so many things. Obstacles will come, but we must tolerate them and move beyond them. Rise early and chant the holy names of the Lord. That's why Krishna says, Tunadapi sunichena tarodapi shahisna amanina manarena kirtaniya sadahari. Right? We must be more tolerant than a tree to be able to chant. So no matter what comes in our way, no excuses. Rise up early, especially during this Brahma Muhurta time, and chant the holy names of the Lord. This type of practice is very important and very powerful in assuring our success. In being able to remember Krishna at the time of death. If it's difficult now to rise at 4 o'clock in the morning and chant, then what is going to be the possibility of remembering him at the time of death? And we'll see this concept in a coming verse about how things are very difficult at that time. So this is our time to practice. And by good chanting, early morning chanting, attentive chanting, hearing our chanting, we can make assured success. So Prabhupada is emphasizing that this is the most important way to be able to remember Krishna. So let us do the best we can in our chanting process. And one of the tests to see how ready am I to remember Krishna at the time of death. When we're driving on the road and some, car comes in our way, what is the first thought that comes into our head? Oh no! Or, oh Krishna. What happens? We walk and we stub our toe, hitting it on the corner of some wall. Then we say, ouch! Or, oh Krishna. When some event happens, what is the first thought that comes to our mind? One friend of mine, a very sweet devotee, he was explaining years ago, he faced a very traumatic situation. He his car broke down and he was walking on the exit ramp off the freeway, and someone pulled up and they pulled a gun out, and he just stood there and he froze in fear. And then after he realized, I didn't think of Krishna once. I better chant more. He was like, it was a great test for me. He's like, I'm not prepared. The thought of Krishna didn't even come. I was on the verge. This guy had a gun. Thankfully, nothing happened. So when we face these situations in our life, what is the first thought that comes to our mind? It is a good indicator of how much I have prepared. And so if Krishna is not coming yet, don't worry, keep chanting. Because the more impressions we make in the mind, the more we fill our mind of Krishna, then the more naturally only thoughts of Krishna will emerge. So what happens if we don't think of Krishna? Well, Krishna says in the 6th verse, whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, O son of Kunti, that state he will attain without fail. So whatever we think about at death, that's what Krishna is going to take us to. He is fulfilling our desire. If we think of Krishna, he'll bring us to him. If we think of our dog, we'll go to our dog. Whatever it is, Krishna is so kind and merciful. Sometimes we wish, no, Krishna, just take me to you. Well, if we keep wishing like this sincerely, not just passively, then it'll happen. Because that is a thought we'll have at the time of death, if that is a thought we have now. Right? So what are we going to think about the time of death? Prabhupada says, our thoughts during our entire life, they influence what we'll think about at the time of death. If my whole life I've never thought of Krishna, then how are we going to remember him at the time of death? But conversely, if my whole life I've been thinking about Krishna, then of course, what am I going to think about at the time of death? Krishna. Sometimes we worry, well, what if I don't? Don't worry about what if you don't. Just spend your life now thinking of Krishna, and you'll be guaranteed success. Again, what is the best process of changing one's state of mind? Chanting. Right? So when we chant, we can change the state of mind. Right? And at the end of our life, what is the best way to focus on Krishna? Chanting. So we can pray that when we are leaving this body, we can be chanting the holy names of the Lord. So this chanting process is the process now to begin to purify our consciousness, to make those impressions, to fill our mind with thoughts of Krishna. And that is the single activity we can hope and pray to be doing at the time of death. Because that can change our state of consciousness to remember Krishna. Right? And thus go to him. And that is the goal of every devotee. So when we chant the holy names of Krishna, let us make sure we are remembering Krishna, and not that we have to vacuum, that I have to return one WhatsApp message, I have to go to work and do this in the office. Oh, I'm going to eat this 3 days from now and I'm going to really enjoy it. And oh, my shoe is not working, so I have to go onto Amazon and buy a new shoe. And all these thoughts that come in to our mind while we're chanting. Let us, at least while we're chanting, focus only on thinking of Krishna. This is the preparation, right, for us. And Prabhupada gives the example of Bharat Maharaj in this context. He was a great devotee. But at the time of death, he thought of a deer and thus became a deer, just as this verse indicates. Whatever state of mind, whatever state of being one remembers at the time of death, they achieve. And Bharat Maharaj is a perfect example of that. But by the blessings of Krishna, in his body of a deer, he remembered his past devotion. He went back to his place of bhakti. He left his body there and came back again as Jada Bharat, and was very careful never to let his consciousness sway from anything else. He acted like an insane person. so that nobody would disturb him. He was actually very sane. He was so intelligent. But he acted unintelligent so that nobody would approach him for any type of work or activity. So that he could focus only on Krishna and not risk thinking of anything else again. So, one second. Yes. Okay. So now, verse 7, Krishna gives us some practical instructions. Therefore, Arjuna, you should always think of me in the form of Krishna, and at the same time, carry out your prescribed duty of fighting. With your activities dedicated to me, and your mind and intelligence fixed on me, you shall attain me without doubt. How many times Krishna says me? It's such a sweet verse. Krishna says, you should always think of me in the form of Krishna, and you'll attain me. You will surely attain me. Establishing the goal. So Krishna says, start now thinking of Krishna while doing your duties. If you start now, then it'll be guaranteed to think of Krishna at the time of death. And so, the question may be that isn't it hard to think of Krishna while doing all our duties? Well, first of all, Arjuna is thinking, oh wait, I just have to think of Krishna. I don't have to fight my battle here. Krishna says, no. While doing your duty, you think of me. Right? So this isn't about going to the forest and thinking about Krishna. This is, no, you stay in your duty, but while doing your duty, you think of me. Now we may think, well, wait a minute, that's difficult to think of Krishna while doing our different activities. Well, if we can't remember Krishna while doing our different activities, then what kind of hope do we have of remembering Krishna at the time of death? When there is so much distress, the body is going through so much difficulty, the voice is choking up, the organs are failing, there is pain and all these things, that is a difficult time to remember Krishna. So, by the practice of remembering while doing all of our duties, we become prepared at this time of death. So this practice by remembering is very important, even if it's difficult. And how does this guarantee success? Well, if I'm only thinking about Krishna from this point forward, then whenever death comes, no matter what, I am prepared. There's no scope of me being unprepared. In this regard, Prabhupada gives the reference of Maharaj Kulashekara. What is his prayer? Let me die now while my mind and body is stable, because now I can think of Krishna. As we age and the difficulties of life progress, it becomes very difficult to think of Krishna, he says. So Maharaj is praying, let me die now while I am able. Not many people pray this way. But the point is very important. That while our body is giving us no trouble, we should focus on thinking of Krishna. So that as we progress, and whenever Krishna has determined our time is up, we are ready, having spent our life practicing only thinking of Krishna. Right? So this is the important instruction we get. Now in the 8th verse, Krishna says, he who meditates on me is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his mind constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated from the path, O Partha, is sure to reach me. If we are undeviated in remembering Krishna, we are sure to reach him. Right? So Krishna is emphasizing here Vishnu Shmarana. So by hearing about Krishna, Shravanam, we become attracted to Krishna. Then we will do Kirtanam, chanting about Krishna. We'll speak about Krishna. We speak about what we are attracted to. Hearing builds attraction, then we speak about Krishna. If we are hearing and chanting about Krishna, then we will always be in Vishnu Shmaranam, remembering Krishna. And remember, what is the foundational principle of all bhakti? Smartavya satatam Vishnu or Vishmartavya najatati Sarva Veda Nishedeshwar Etayodeva Kinkaraha. One should always remember Krishna and never forget him. All the rules and regulations of all Shastra should be servants to these two principles. Always remember Krishna and never forget him. And now we see why. Because this is the key to attaining the Supreme. Remember him always. Never forget him. So this is the goal of what we do in our devotional service. Right? And Prabhupada comments in the purport that even our misgivings, our attachments, our weaknesses, they can easily be overcome by remembering Krishna. This higher taste, by remembering Krishna, it's so powerful that our deeply rooted, conditioned nature can be transformed and overcome. So while this may sound, oh, what's my hope of forgetting everything else and only remembering Krishna, Prabhupada is giving us some great faith and confidence because this Krishna consciousness, being conscious of Krishna. Why we say Krishna consciousness? Because we always want to be conscious of Krishna, remembering Krishna. This is the foundation. It's so powerful, it can overcome all of our attachments and weaknesses and misgivings. So this, again, chanting is the key to remembering. Right? Prabhupada writes in this purport, one's memory of Krishna is revived by chanting the Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna. That's what Prabhupada says. And then towards the end of the purport, he says, the mind is fickle, and therefore it is necessary to engage the mind by force to think of Krishna. So he's got this fickle mind. We heard about it in the 6th chapter. Prabhupada again is encouraging us. Use the powerful means of chanting to engage this mind. And then one is sure to reach Krishna by remembering him. That is it. If all we are doing is bhakti in remembering Krishna and never forget him, smarta bhavaya satatam Vishnu, then we'll always remember him. So there's no scope to possibly forget. Right? And this is the principle of bhakti, to be undeviated in remembering him. So finally in verse 9, Krishna now says, one should meditate upon the Supreme Person as the one who knows everything, as he who is the oldest, who is the controller, who is smaller than the smallest, who is the maintainer of everything, who is beyond all material conception, who is inconceivable, and who is always a person. He is luminous like the sun, and he is transcendental, beyond this material nature. So Krishna now is giving 10 specific qualities that one can meditate on. But we cannot meditate on something abstract or void or undefined. So Krishna is giving these 10 qualities and is specifically speaking to those who are pursuing the yoga process, those who are trying to meditate upon him in the super soul with the goal of liberation. Right? So if you remember back to the 28th verse of the 7th chapter, 29th verse, Krishna said, intelligent persons who are endeavoring for liberation. Right? So these are the yoga bhaktas. This is in the construct of yoga mishra bhakti. So it's mixed bhakti. It is bhakti, but it's mixed with this desire for freedom from birth and death. Not necessarily merging into the Supreme, but freedom from birth and death. Right? So Krishna, for them, is saying, you meditate upon him in the super soul with these qualities. So what are these qualities? All knowing. Krishna knows past, present, and future, Prabhupada explains. Sometimes in devotional service, we become, frustrated that, I did this service and, wasn't recognized. Nobody even noticed. But who is always noticing our service? Krishna. He is all knowing. We should remember that. He always knows. That's all that matters. Someone thinks we did something improper, but we actually didn't do it. Don't worry. Krishna knows what our intent was, what our purpose was. He's the oldest of all. What does that mean? He has lots of gray hair? No. It means he is the origin of everything. The oldest, the absolute oldest, must be the first principal cause of all other causes. So oldest of all means he is the origin of everything. Everyone else has come after him. And thus, he is the oldest. He is the controller. Everything is happening under his jurisdiction. What is the relevance of him being the smallest of the smallest? It means he's present even in the tiny atom. There is nowhere he is not present. He is the maintainer. All the food grains, the rains, the air, everything we need to live. All the planets floating in perfect precision. All maintained by Krishna. Beyond material conception and inconceivable. We'll combine these two. He's achintya. He can enter into an atom, but he can also maintain these giant universes and planets moving in perfect order. He can pervade the whole world, yet be completely aloof and beyond it at the same time. You know, we struggle to conceive of just this solar system. Yet, this solar system is just a limited number of planets within this whole universe. And then there are millions and billions and unlimited number of universes. And all of that comprises just a small fraction of the total creation, because the spiritual world is many, many times larger than even the material creation. All of this is known to Krishna. It's inconceivable. We cannot conceive of any of it, but Krishna, his potencies to manage all of this, it's inconceivable. He's always a person. This is the critical. It's impossible to meditate and avoid. The supreme truth is Krishna as a person. So these are some of the qualities that are manifest that we can try to meditate on in remembering Krishna. Of course, as devotees, situated and attempting in pure bhakti, we then can take to the platform of meditating on, Krishna in all of his different pastimes of Vrindavan, reading Krishna book and remembering all the sweet activities of the Supreme Lord and how he engages in different relationships and activities with his devotees. That can be the basis of our meditation, to consume our consciousness, to always think of Krishna, and thus, even at the time of death, we'll be meditating on the Supreme Lord and attain him for sure. And if we practice today and are always thinking about him, we never be in fear. It will happen. Okay? So this is the first 9 verses of chapter 8, Attaining the Supreme. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki. Ananta Koti Vaishnavinda ki. Any questions or comments, clarifications, corrections?
Thank you for a wonderful class as usual.
Hare Krishna.
A lot of joy to my weekend. I just want a quick review of the newer terms for me. Adhyatma, so this is Sanatana Dharma, right?
Yes, it's the nature of the living entity. Yep, you can say that is this. It's not the, but it's referring to an eternal nature. Yep.
Adhibhuta, then this is Prakriti, right? This is the material nature of the Lord.
Yeah, and the specific aspect of it being ever-changing.
Okay.
Yeah, the ever-changing material nature, because that ever-changing is what indicates the extraordinary power of the material nature, and that power comes from Krishna.
And that it's basically unmaintainable by us trying to lord over it.
Correct. We can't stop that ever. Right? Our whole efforts are trying to make everything permanent in this material world, but we can't. Even though we think we're so powerful, we can't stop this ever-changing nature. So it signifies the great potency of Krishna, being the controller of this ever-changing nature.
The Deva, the sum of which is the Virat root.
Yes, and so the Lord of all of the devatas, the demigods, who are very powerful themselves, that is the universal form. Yep.
And then lastly, Adi Yagna. So this is Krishna himself. This is Paramatma. This is Bhagavan.
Well, so all three are different aspects of the absolute truth. So we can say that specifically it's Paramatma here, but we don't distinguish between Paramatma and ultimately Bhagavan, because Paramatma is an expansion from Bhagavan. So, but specifically the Adi Yagya here is the Super Soul, present in the heart of every living entity. And so all the work that we do, the real Purusha is Krishna. He is the true enjoyer, the beneficiary of all the sacrifices. And we'll see this, we saw it in chapter 5, and we'll see it again in chapter 13, more specifically. Yep.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu, thank you for the registration of
No, that's yes.
very nice lecture. Thank you so much. One question is like you talked about Krishna, remembering Krishna in all aspects of life practically. Could you a little bit elaborate on that part? Like how do we practically do it? I mean, chanting, focus on it. When we do devotional service, try that. All aspects, it's really hard to kind of keep a conscious bearing of remembering Krishna.
Yeah.
Like, well, as you said, no, when Arjuna was doing his duty of fighting, his consciousness has to be to remember Krishna. It's not like we have to renunciate and do that. So while doing duty, all the time thinking Krishna, how is it practically possible? Could you?
Yeah. So it is difficult, and the point is that yes, it is difficult, but it's even more difficult to remember at the time of death when things are so distressed. So if it's difficult right now, when we are relatively, again, relative to the times of approaching death, stable, mind is not so swirling, body is functioning reasonably well, then what's the hope at the time of death to remember, right? When, oh my God, I forgot to do this, I need to do that, right? And then the body, everything's breaking down. So you're right, it's not so easy to remember practically in all of our activities. So Krishna's point here, start practicing now. Start trying to understand. So in the 7th chapter, he gave us some clear ways in which we can see that everything we are doing is in relation to Krishna. Right? So next time we drink a glass of water, we can remember, the essence of this taste is Krishna. Next time we are enjoying the sun, such a nice sunny day, that sun, that heat, that warmth is coming from Krishna. Next time we are out on a nice walk and we observe a beautiful, bird in the tree, think, wow, this is the creation of Krishna. Right? So we start to realize that everything is related to Krishna. So why he gave knowledge of the Absolute, to help facilitate our constant meditation upon him. So in doing our duties, we remember, why am I doing these duties? Right? Why am I going to the office? To serve Krishna. So yes, in doing my activities, I may not be directly doing Vishnu Shmaranam, remembering how Krishna was running in the fields with the cowherd boys while I'm programming a computer or pulling out a tooth or whatever your profession may be. But I can remember and have consciousness that my performance of this activity is connected to my devotional service. I am cooking for my family. Well, I'm cooking for Krishna. I am, taking my kids to this activity and that. I'm trying to raise my child as a devotee. So we remind ourselves of the connectivity of every action we are doing to Krishna. And this is also a great way to filter out, wait a minute, this activity is not connected to Krishna. There's no way I can rationally connect it to Krishna. Right? All my sense enjoyment that I may do, it's a nice way to filter that out. So as the practical way for us is to continually remind ourselves as we're doing our various duties how they are connected to the Supreme Lord. In this way, we'll see Him and be conscious of Him in all endeavors. And whatever is difficult becomes easy by practice. Everything that we've learned has been difficult at first, but by practice, it becomes easy. Right? And that's why Prabhupada always used to quote, impossible is a word in the fool's dictionary. Yes, it may be impossible by our endeavor, but by the mercy of Guru and Krishna, it can happen. So Krishna, that's why in the 7th verse, he's encouraging us to do this. So let's do the best we can and keep trying to see Krishna and be conscious of Krishna as much as possible. And whatever we are conscious today, tomorrow, just 1 millisecond more. 1 fraction of a second more. And the next day a little more, a little more, a little more. And just build. So that's how we can do it. Yeah, difficult, but very doable by the mercy of Krishna and Guru. But at a minimum, let us be attentive of Krishna while chanting. At the absolute minimum. While we're chanting, let us not let the mind go anywhere else. There's plenty of time for that throughout the rest of the day. At least during our chanting, let us be fully fixed on thinking of Krishna. And that is the ultimate essence that Prabhupada is giving. Chant incessantly the holy names of the Lord. Is that okay?
Yes, Prabhuji. Thank you so much. And like the way you mentioned today, if we are not conscious now, then as you rightly said, then at that point of death when our life breath is choking, in such a difficult situation, we don't know what kind of death we might have, right? So then how can we even fathom to think about it? So that itself should bring about some kind of realization. Thank you, Prabhuji.
That's why Prabhupada says, tolerate the difficulties, the impediments now. If we can't tolerate and work through the impediments of I'm sleepy, or this, that, or the other, I'm hungry, or this, how are we going to tolerate the impediments of death? We won't. So, we push ourselves a little bit to overcome those impediments and be determined. And don't let anything get in the way of our chanting. Be very focused. There are plenty of reasons not to do it. Plenty of excuses will be there. Unlimited. But those will also be present in many more forms at the time of death. So if we overcome the lesser ones now, we have hope to overcome the bigger ones later. That was the point Prabhupada is making in the purport, talking about tolerance. Tolerate those impediments.
Yes, Prabhuji, thank you.
Hare Krishna. Thank you. This was an online question. Looks like.
Hare Krishna. Thinking and worshipping Krishna at the time of death compensates the bad karmas?
Well, Krishna says, Antakale chamameva smaram muktva kalevaram. Smaram. If you think of him at the time of death, you will reach him. No doubt, he says. So yes, if you can think of Krishna at the time of death, you can overcome all your past karma. And in Srimad Bhagavatam, we have a very wonderful example of this, the story of Ajamil, who overcame a lifetime of sinful activities that began with various pious Brahminical ways. And he overcame all of that by calling out Narayan. Not even the Supreme Lord Narayan, his son Narayan. So that shows the power of this chanting. But we must be very careful to think, oh, wait a minute, this is easy. I'll go do all my sinful life all life long, and the moment of death, I'll think of Krishna. I'm good. You liken that to a child telling father, I don't need to go to school. Well, how you'll make money and maintain yourself? No, I don't need to go to school. I'll just buy one lottery ticket. I'll win, and then I'll maintain myself. I'm good. Now, in theory, that could work. Theoretically, it's possible. But is that a reliable strategy to maintain one's existence? No. So similarly, in theory, it's possible that I can remember Krishna at the time of death, even though I haven't remembered him my whole life. In theory, it's possible. But is that a chance you want to take? No. So, yes, thinking of Krishna at the time of death frees one of all of their sinful life and takes one to the supreme abode. So that is the potency of Vishnu Shmaranam. That is the power of it. But, and I know this wasn't the question, but we should not use that as a means that, okay, I'm good. Go on doing my nonsensical ways, and at the time of death, I'll just remember Krishna. It's not practical, because it won't happen in all likelihood. Because as Prabhupada said, the life's thoughts that we accumulate during our lifetime influence what we'll think about at the time of death. So, but yes, we should be assured that if we think about Krishna at the time of death, and that's why he says in this verse, of this, there is no doubt. Right? He says, samshaya, doubt. There is no doubt. To clarify if we have some doubt. It's all it takes. Remembering him at the time of death. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Sorry, I'm trying to respect some following.
Hare Krishna. Yeah, he can hear you clearly.
Yeah, Danda Pranada, thank you very much. Nice class.
Dandavats.
Yeah, regarding the same question Mata just asked question. So, remembering Krishna,
Yes.
when we are angry and frustrated, so how does Arjuna remember Krishna when, of course, in the battlefield he has to be in the angry and frustration mode to kill some of the soldiers. So, but it's very difficult for, at least for me, to remember Krishna when we get into the frustration mode of anger.
Yeah.
So, will Arjuna remember that?
Yeah. No, it's a nice point because, so anger, right? We talked about in Nectar of Instruction, Krodha, right? So there is a transcendental or there is a spiritual anger. So anger, when it is used for our own sense gratification or basically our uncontrolled, lust that manifests anger, that is not transcendental. And remembering Krishna, can be difficult. But in the service of Krishna, there is sometimes the use of anger, to protect the devotees, to protect, Krishna. And of course, Krishna is beyond our scope of protection, but we protect Krishna. So, you see Srila Prabhupada very ferociously fought with, the landowners for Juhu we were discussing last night. Or, Srila Prabhupada sometimes would become angry at a disciple for transgressing. But that wasn't uncontrolled anger. That was anger to try to inspire them to take seriously to the process of devotional service. So it's in the service of Krishna. So Arjuna's anger is a means to perform Krishna's work, which is to fight the battle. Right? So whereas when we become angry, at least in most instances, our anger comes from a material affliction. Right? So as Krishna explained in the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, that from lust manifest anger. So most of our anger comes from our lust, our material attachments. When they go unsatisfied, I become angry, right? When my desire to control is thwarted, I become angry, right? When my children don't do what I say, I become angry. When someone doesn't follow my instruction, my desire again to control, it becomes anger, right? So in those circumstances, that is not transcendental, but how we can connect it, and we can remember that this anger is a impurity in the heart that is preventing me from my Krishna consciousness. And so when we become angry, we can, kind of talk ourselves down from that. Thinking, wait a minute, this is just born out of my bodily identification. And remind ourselves, no, I should not become angry. But sometimes, I use the example of parenting. Sometimes in parenting, we have to, we call feign or pretend anger to inspire the child to do something correctly. But that's not uncontrolled anger, right? That's not unleashed. That is very premeditated, if you will. I have to pretend to be upset in order to inspire that child to maybe follow something. But we should not have uncontrolled anger. So there's a difference when we use it as a purpose or when it's a result, an uncontrolled result of some emotion. And so those are the two differences. And we try to know that, yes, sometimes there's anger to be used in the service of Krishna. Though rare, it can be used in the service of Krishna. But most times, as you said, it's through our experience. So we try to remember again, I am spirit soul. Krishna is the supreme controller. I am an instrument in his plan. Most of those top talks will dissipate whatever it is that we're angry about. And
Yeah, but in service of Krishna also, if we use anger, that means we are suppressing our humility.
not necessarily.
Not humble.
Not necessarily. So humble doesn't mean weak, right? So humble doesn't mean weak. Humble means I know who I am. I am an insignificant, tiny spark of Krishna. That's humility. It doesn't mean weak. Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur was ferocious, but he was very humble. Lord Nityananda, straw and teeth, but he was very powerful, very ferocious as well. So anger doesn't mean that I think I'm great, I can conquer something through anger, right? But sometimes that is needed in the service of Krishna, right? So Prabhupada, when he was, getting into the disputes with the Juhu landowner, he was expressing anger, animation, to show this person, I'm serious. I will fight for Radha Rasa Vihari. I'm not going to go away quietly. Don't think I'm some old Swami who's sitting in the forest chanting. You want to fight? We'll fight for Krishna. Because anger is like that.
So similar way, it's extended question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Similar way, shall we use other Arshad Vargas basically like not telling the truth, sometimes just telling some lie to make the service of Krishna continue or happen.
So yeah, there are times where that happens, right? Krishna did that himself on the battlefield,
That's
right? But we have to be very pure in our intent and purpose to be able to do so. So if we are very elevated, like even using anger, right? As a sadhaka, I would be extraordinarily careful ever to use anger in service, because there's a high likelihood that we will misuse it and then create offenses, right? Because there's such a, we're not, if you're pure, just like I'll just use a very mundane material example, right? A gun. A gun is very dangerous. But if you're very well trained in how to use it, then it can be used for some good. But if you're not well trained, you better not even go close to it, because you can mess it up, right? So anger like this, in transcendental anger, at least for me, quite foolish, stay away from it. At least attempt to stay away from it. Because unless you're very, pure in the purpose of using it, then you have the potential to misuse it, right? So the conservative way is not to use anger, not to tell, mistruths, right? Because we know the Brahminical quality is to be very straightforward, not duplicitous. But again, in Krishna's service, sometimes that might be used, right? So, and that's where we take guidance, right? So next time somebody doesn't do something in the temple and service, I'm getting angry for Krishna's service. No. Don't, let us not follow, because that is not likely, in all likelihood, to be spiritual anger. More than likely, that is to be our ego, as you said, right? This lack of humility, that they're not doing what I said. They're not following me, because I think I am the supreme controller, right? So that's where that anger is an expression of lack of humility, as you very nicely pointed out. But the spiritual anger is an utmost acknowledgement of humility, because one is actually pretending to be angry, almost as if an actor on behalf of Krishna, knowing they actually have no real ability to do anything unless Krishna wants it to happen. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful questions. Very, very precise in both how to do this. It's difficult. It's a good acknowledgement, and then some of these characteristics. So how we don't kind of apply them. Yeah, very nice. Thank you. Anything else? And remembering Krishna. Okay. So if not, we'll continue discussing chapter 8 next week in Attaining the Supreme. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Adanta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki jai. Hare Krishna. Dandava Pranams.